some people think that multi-cloud means that instead of using one cloud provider, why not use lots of them? But then the real question is, am I combining the benefits or do I combine the risk?
This is Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, a podcast for IT leaders and implementers looking to reliably scale database ops while maintaining control of their data stack. In each episode, we join industry experts to discuss the what and why of sovereignty and how you can implement the Sovereign DBaaS concept of your own using open source databases, deployment models, and tooling. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, brought to you by Severalnines. I'm Vinay Joosery, co-founder and CEO of Severalnines. And our guest today is Frank Karlitschek. I hope I pronounced that right. Co-founder and CEO of NextCloud. Thanks for joining us today, Frank. And before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Of course. So first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's really great to be here on the show. That's really an honor. Yeah, what do I do? Good question. A lot of things. So I'm doing all kinds of open source things for 25 years, for a long time. Yes, I'm old. So at the beginning, like in the 90s, was a lot of KDE. I was involved in the KDE open source project. Then a number of different other projects from open desktop, open PC, open collaboration services and other things. But nowadays, I'm probably most well known as a founder and CEO of NextCloud. And NextCloud is, for the ones of you who don't know it, it's a collaboration software. So it's software that you can use to work together between your friends and family, colleagues over the internet with all the tools you need for that. For example, the file sync and share part to share your files between you and your colleagues on all the different devices, chat, video conferencing, mail, calendar, contacts, notes, project management, and so on. So very similar to Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Slack, Zoom, and so on, with the difference that we are the only real open source alternative. So we are 100% open source, and you can really run it and host it wherever you want. So all the other companies I just mentioned are, of course, companies from the US. And if you don't like that, then you can use NextCloud to put it on any infrastructure, and you have your own local collaboration suite. And this really works from like small instances. If you want to run it on a Raspberry Pi for your family, that's fine. But there are also organizations who have millions of users, and this also works fine.
Yeah, excellent. And actually, true open source, as you mentioned, real open source, we'll get into that because that's kind of been a bit of a hot potato. What is open source and what is not, right? And how companies are dealing with that. So let's talk a little bit first about, let's say the more recent changes in the broader sovereignty landscape, right? And you talked about hosters, hyperscalers, and there has been sort of responses from the hyperscalers, right? And we talk about things like AWS sovereignty and how it handles GDPR, So it's a pretty complex question, right? Sovereignty. It's about where is your data located? Who has control over it? It's about, do you have a sovereign stack that you can actually run yourself anywhere you want, right? Do you have control over that, right? And, we are a database company, right? So we talk a lot about databases, and, sometimes we don't talk enough about, a lot of the discussion typically is about, sort of legislation, and things like that. But there's also databases, there's licenses, there's services, right? So starting off with data and, GDPR, data transfer from EU to the US, right? Now, we know that the hyperscalers, they own the lion's share, right, of the EU cloud market. And that puts a lot of EU data under US jurisdiction, really, right? And for the last 10 years, we've been going back and forth, right, whether it is okay or not, right? I mean, a quick recap: we had Safe Harbor agreement, right, which was cancelled by Schrems 1, right, in 2015. Safe Harbor was replaced by Privacy Shield, right, and that was cancelled by Schrems 2 in 2020, right? And basically, at that point, it was basically saying that data flows from EU to the US under the Privacy Shield is not okay. But then about a year ago, right, we had the executive order from Mr. Biden, right, to address these concerns from Schrems 2, right? Basically enhancing safeguards for United States signals intelligence activities, right? And a few months ago, almost like a letter from the post, right, we saw that there was an adequacy decision, right, for EU-US data flows, right? So basically, the EU is saying now that data transfers to the USA are not objectionable, right, from a data protection perspective, right? So, Schrems Redux, right, will, what's the issue here? I mean, we have a sort of presidential order that can be reversed by the next president, but I mean, are we really addressing Europe as a continent? Are we really addressing the heart of this sort of Schrems litigation? What's your take on this?
Wow, this is a big question. So maybe I can answer specifically about the legal situation, and then maybe second part answering your real question about the big picture. So about the specifics, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I talk with some lawyers. For example, also I had the honor to have Max Schrems as our keynote speaker at our conference a few weeks ago. And a lot of people think that the latest sort of solution agreement will go the same way than the first two, because the fundamentals are the same. The thing is that there are laws in the US that then make it clear that secret services and law enforcement and other organizations in the US can access the data if they want to. And then there are laws in Europe which say GDPR that this is not okay. And this is just a fundamental conflict. And actually all other things that are tried are just fundamentally weaker. For example, an executive order from the president is a weaker tool than a law. So you cannot really overrule a law with that, right? This doesn't work in the democracy, doesn't work in the US. And also some companies like Microsoft say, no problem. We just do special agreements. We just do a special contract between the two organizations. And the contract says your data is secure, but it's not possible to do a private contract between two companies that overrule the law. So that's fundamentally just not possible. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but from what Max Schrems and other people say that this is a fundamental problem that cannot really be solved. But to answer your real bigger question is a bit, so I find it very interesting because as I said at the beginning, I'm doing open source free software for a long time, for 25 years. And I mean, it was always the idea of free software and open source to give people control over their data. Of course, this whole philosophy came from a pre-cloud era in a way, right? It was just under the assumption that, hey, I have my computer and my computer is on my desk or something, or under my desk, or it is if it's a mainframe, it's in the basement somewhere, I don't know. And I'm accessing this computer. And if on this computer is open source running or free software running, then I can see the source code. I can see what's happening. It basically means that I'm in full control of my IT. But of course, at the time we try to do lobbying to politicians that, hey, open source is great, and open source is great. But it was really hard for them to understand why something like open source is really relevant. Because if you then ask, okay, what is it? It's software licenses. Software licenses are boring. So who wants to deal with software licenses? I don't know. But in the meantime, a lot of things change. So first of all, the cloud came along, which means your computer is not really under your desk anymore. It's running somewhere on the other side of the planet by another company. And you also don't really know what's happening, what's running on the cloud. Maybe there you uploaded some open source software there, sure, but in part of the infrastructure, also some not open source tools. And you don't really know what's going on there. That's the first change. And the second change is then that people realize that it is actually important, right? Because we have these espionage scandals and like influencing elections and all kinds of things, social media, and everybody understands that IT is very important for our society now. So people care. And then this is when the new term digital sovereignty came along, because open source somehow did not really work from a marketing perspective, because licenses are boring. But if you say, hey, if it's not about licenses, it's about sovereignty. Do you want to be sovereign? Do you want to be in control of everything? And this is asking like a citizen, or also asking a politician. Then everybody said, yeah, I want to be in control. I want to know what's going on. And this is where this whole term of digital sovereignty came along. And I think it's an interesting term. It's better to understand than open source for a lot of people. But it's, of course, like there's a lot of citing going on because everybody wants to define sovereignty as they want. So as you mentioned briefly a little bit, there are like hyperscalers who call the offering now sovereign. But the question is, of course, is it really sovereign? Because at the end, it's just still the same. Cloud computing is proprietary software. So sovereignty, of course, means being in control of everything. And that's the question. If you use AWS or Azure or something and it's not suddenly sovereign because of the marketing, are you really in control or not?
Yeah. Actually, that's interesting that you said that, open source is really about control, right? Because, open source means many things. For some people, it means, hey, it's free software, right? I get to use it. I don't have to pay. But this idea about control, actually, how did we lose it on the way?
Yeah, I think a big part is the cloud computing era, where it's running somewhere else. And you see that you actually not to dive into licenses too much, but we even see the problems in licenses themselves, because the GPL, as the poster child open source license, free software license, has had this loophole, right? That if the software is actually running somewhere else, then the GPL does not really work anymore. This is why the HGPL needed to be created to stop this loophole. That if you're using a software, even if you don't run it yourself, but if you use it, that you should have the same rights. And this is a problem. This doesn't exist if it's running on your computer on your desk. But if it's run over the internet, then it's a different thing. And yeah, it's interesting that times are changing, and our legal frameworks, our licenses, all our things need to adapt to it. I don't want to read the discussion here, but we have the same situation at the moment with the AI, MCI, tools, where also AI, because AI is only partly software, the other part is data, then the whole software licenses are not really enough anymore. So it also needs to be like a readjustment of everything again to give you the digital sovereignty.
Yeah. And actually that's, in a way, we lost control on the way, so to speak, and sovereignty, as you mentioned it's a way for people to kind of maybe better realize that, hey, we have control over our infrastructure, we have control over our data, and that's important. So, and in a way, I guess sovereignty, has it mainly been driven, you would say, by, let's say, privacy and legislation, GDPR? Because, when the cloud first came around, 15 years ago, when actually people started using it, it was probably around a bit earlier, but, it was never a question, should I run my infrastructure there? It was just really let's outsource all the work to this cloud provider. And, if we have databases, we don't have to deal with the headache. We can just, give it to somebody else.
Yeah. I like that you use the term outsourcing, because this is what it really is. And as a company, as a government, as a citizen, you cannot do everything yourself, right? I don't build my own car, I don't build my own house, I'm not creating my own water or something, right? So it's totally normal to outsource things to other people. In IT, it also makes sense to outsource things. But it's important that some things are still there so that you actually know what you're doing, who is delivering that to you. What are there some safety standards, are some privacy standards that are followed? Are there actually different suppliers, or is there only one in the market where there's a monopoly and a vendor login? And yeah, is there sovereignty? And I think it's always bad to compare this with other things, but in your electricity, I mean, there are sovereignty because there are actually different options that you can get your electricity and different kind of like power plants. And so there is a choice. And there's also some safety standards that the electricity I get is, I don't know, it's not killing my devices or something here, or that I can switch to a different supplier if the cost is too high, and so on and so on. So there's some sovereignty there. And I think we have to make sure that there's the same for just outsourcing in IT too. And it's a bit of a problem because if you, I don't know, give all your IT to AWS or something, then there is not really sovereignty, right? Because you cannot move from AWS to another cloud provider because the IP APIs are completely different, right? It's just not possible. You need to re-engineer everything if you want to do that. And also the privacy GDPR requirements are not fulfilled, as we just discussed. That's the problem. And as a citizen, I want to make sure that it is all like compliant and legal, and it's not. That's the problem. And yeah, it's just not transparent. It's just not sovereign. Yeah.
Well, the question is, you mentioned electricity. I mean, the point is, if I change my electricity provider, I don't have to change my fridge or my microwave, right? So it's and also electricity, it is a regulated market, right?
Yeah.
As it is, mission critical infrastructure, as we would call it, right? And I mean, the cloud is not there yet. It's not really somehow. Should it be should it be regulated, same as we do with electricity or power plants or whatever it is?
I think it should. It should. It should for safety reasons. It should for that there's a free competition. There's a market there, and not just a handful of big players. Yeah, it should.
Yeah. So in a way, we talk about sovereign and sovereignty also because there's been all this ambiguity, right, surrounding these data flows. 1 year it's not okay. The next year is okay. Companies, especially those who are heavily invested in a hyperscaler, they will wait. They will not kind of start changing things, right? We have had a guest on this podcast who was doing healthcare data, and actually they moved from AWS to a most of made in Europe cloud, right? OpenStack based, but. So some companies are doing it, but then looking at some statistics from Accenture, for example, I see 37% of European enterprises have already invested in sovereign cloud infrastructure, right? 44% they are planning to invest in the next 2 years, right? So, almost predictably, right? We see Google's cloud, on Europe's terms initiative, right? AWS, a European sovereign cloud, and lately we see Microsoft, right? Cloud for sovereignty. So all these new hyperscaler, sovereignty infrastructure solutions, are they truly sovereign, right? Or is it just, as we call it, sovereignty washing?
I think the later. I think it's sovereignty washing. There are two big things that come to mind. The first is it doesn't really solve the whole Cloud Act GDPR problem, as I mentioned at the beginning, because the legislation in the US doesn't really care where the data is located. It only cares if it's operated and controlled by a US entity. And putting a data center, and Amazon putting a data center in Europe might make sense from a latency perspective or something. It's closer to the consumers, but it doesn't make a difference from a legal perspective. So the Cloud Act still is active there. So this does not really solve it. And again, the other aspect that I also just mentioned around the open standards and the option to shift between vendors, that's of course also not there, right? All these vendors have that strong vendor logins. And so you cannot really shift between them. So it also doesn't provide sovereignty from that perspective.
Right. And actually, this is also one more thing, right? If we want to be sovereign, maybe we want to promote more providers, more competition, free movement, right? And but looking at the current, let's say, practices, right, of the current market, like the leaders, the market leaders, you look at the egress fees, for example. I mean, having a multi-cloud type infrastructure where you're actually constantly chatting between two clouds, which means even though there is peering and there is no actual data going to the internet, maybe the data is actually going, between one sub-rack to another sub-rack somewhere, right? But customers are getting charged quite a bit of money, right? I mean, there's the egress, and then there's also the fact that nowadays we see more of those committed usage discounts, right? So which means you commit for X number of years. I mean, these things make it even harder, right, to get to a state where we can see this is a sovereign type environment, right, where we have some edge of control where we can actually move between players.
Yeah. So that's very interesting that you mentioned multi-cloud, because that's also a discussion I have with a lot of people here, also in the German government, for example. And it's completely unclear what it means, multi-cloud. So for some people, it means you can choose between different clouds. And that's good. But then the question is, can I choose only once and then I have the vendor login? Or can I also switch between them during using it? This would be the real goal, right? Because choosing at the beginning is like, actually heard this at an event, Microsoft event that I attended a while ago. They said like digital sovereignty means that you'll have the decision which contract to sign. That your mind is clear, you're not using any drugs or something. Then you're in a clear mind, then you have the Microsoft and the Google contract in front of you, and then you sign one or the other, and then you're sovereign. But that's of course not really true, because it would require that you can also switch between them at any point. And that's, of course, as I said, not possible. The second thing with multi-cloud is some people think that multi-cloud means that instead of using one cloud provider, why not use lots of them? But then the real question is, am I combining the benefits or do I combine the risks? Because, I mean, if I have contract with AWS, Google Cloud and Azure, just to name the three, and I'm using all the services from them, then I have 3 times the vendor login instead of 1 times the vendor login. But what I would really want to have is no vendor login. So a lot of cases, multi-cloud is actually worse than just picking one cloud, because you suddenly have 3 vendors. And if each of them increase the prices, you have to pay. You have no choice, because you cannot really switch between them. There are some things like, I don't know, all these cloud providers that provide like compute instances, like virtual machines or some containerized environments. This is something where you maybe can switch between them, or some S3 storage or something. But even in your area with databases, it's already getting a bit complicated. And then advanced services like your payment service or something, there's no standard, there's no compatibility. It's a complete proprietary APIs. So that's really a problem.
Yeah. So most of the talk is about, infrastructure and regulations, but coming back to databases, or, what actual, sovereignty is, which is a function of control, right? So let's look at licensing. You touched upon it briefly at the beginning. So, open source has been around for, 20, 25 years, but then recently we've seen companies like MongoDB, Elastic, and even recently, HashiCorp, right? Change the license midstream, right? Which started off as open source, but then they actually decided to remove certain rights, right? For example, the ability to provide, the product as a managed service, right? So, what are the obvious and not so obvious differences between, these different open source license schemes?
Yeah, this is obviously one of the big discussions in the open source community last few years. The problem is as you described, that this product is open source, software is open source, everybody's using it. And like the big organizations, they come to you and they buy probably service as a support contract or something like that, because they want to have the safety that if it's mission critical, that someone can help them if something breaks. And it's a successful business model in the open source world, like forever. And now we have the challenge that some cloud providers just then host the software themselves for customers, and they provide them with the support. And the actually people who actually build the software, they are no longer have a business model. And this is, of course, a challenge. And yeah, as you mentioned, there are a number of organizations who change their licenses now to some business source, or the number of new invented licenses, which basically say, hey, everybody can still use it, but the big service provider, like big cloud providers, not. Something like that with different variations. Yeah, the problem is that this is no longer open source. It's no longer open source software because it has its restriction, which is not part of the open source definition. So this is, of course, a problem. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I understand the companies, the open source companies, from one perspective, that really want to protect themselves from these big tech organizations taking away their business. On the other hand, all these companies that you mentioned, they're already so big. They already have such huge revenue, customer base, team size, that you wonder if it's really a problem. I mean, who is optimizing which revenue there? I mean, we, from a perspective of NextCloud, for example, we are fully open source, and we don't have no plans to add this kind of restrictions, and we are doing fine. We are growing nicely. We are fully profitable. We have happy users. We have a happy community. We're doing fine. So at some point, as I said, I understand these big companies that they introduce these restrictions. On the other hand, I'm wondering if this is also mostly triggered by some venture capital funded organizations who really want to optimize their profit to 100%. I don't have a good answer. All I'm saying is there are actually other real open source companies who are still doing fine, NextCloud and many others.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, many of these, even these hyperscalers, a huge piece of the business is built on open source itself, right? I mean, Google wouldn't be here maybe if there was no open source. I mean, they just build a massive infrastructure and yeah. But what does the proliferation of alternative licenses mean for open source, right? I mean, does it mean we'll see more vendors using open source as a way to market the software, get the initial traction, build the user base, and then change their license midstream, right? Or does it mean it will maybe lead to more forks, right? Which means more fragmentation of user bases and maybe less dev resources for projects, right? Or would it be that, companies now starting off, maybe they will say, hey, we won't go open source. We'll start with, you mentioned the business source license, the BSL, we have the SSPL, right? That not going to be built. I mean, what's your thought there?
Yeah, this is the interesting question, and really depends how it goes the next years, I think. I mean, I really don't like this effect, this new licensing has in the open source community, because a lot of people might now think that it's not possible to do an open source company, which I think is totally not the case. So I'm a bit worried about the negative effects there. And I'm also a bit worried that what kind of conversations might happen in some board meetings or some meetings of some VC companies with young startups. Some people might think that this is actually a great strategy. With startups super open, you basically become the dominant player. And once you have it, you close down your product and then you monetize it. I'm really wondering, I'm really worried that some VCs might think that this is a good strategy, because I'm coming from a different perspective, right? Because as I said, I'm doing open source for 25 years, and I didn't start to do open source because I thought it's great to do a big company exit at some point. It was never the plan. The plan was to do something to build software that helps everybody, to do something good, to work together with the community, to provide a tool that helps people to learn, to study, to innovate, to protect the data, and so on, from a more idealistic perspective. And I'm a bit worried that this open source might now look more like a business trick at the beginning to make your company big.
I mean, what is the effect on enterprises in a way? I mean, looking from an enterprise point of view, you maybe you would like to use MongoDB, you would like to purchase MongoDB directly from a hyperscaler, right? Now you have to go to a specific service, Atlas, to get it as a service, right? So maybe perhaps before it was possible to use the same software everywhere, right? But the license changes, and then suddenly you can't get that software everywhere you want, right? You can perhaps use it, most of these, well, actually, the business source license, I think you have to pay, right? You only get 2-year-old versions for free, right? Yep. So you don't get to really use the latest software. I mean, from an enterprise point of view, what effect do you see that having on them?
Yeah, that's of course a problem, because on one hand, of course, it sounds nice that you have access to these old versions, but old versions are not the same than the new versions, obviously. So the feature set and APIs and things obviously changed in the last 2 years. So this is not the same. So as you said, this all leads to a big fragmentation. This just leads to a big fragmentation everywhere. And in the past, you could, if you want to build an application or something on top of Mongo or some other tool, you can be sure, or you were sure that first of all, that you can always use it, and that it's also always the same, because everybody can just use the latest version, and that there are no unexpected costs popping up at some point, right? And all these other benefits and freedoms that people like when using open source. And yeah, now we're moving to a world where it's hugely fragmented. Fragmented, it's not a word.
Fragmented, yeah.
Fragmented. So you don't really know which version it is, which features it has. Is the fork the same than the original, and so on. So it's just gets chaotic, which is not good for anyone.
No, it's certainly not good for the software itself. I mean, it gets, the resources are more diluted, and you don't get the same critical mass adoption kind of thing, right? Because that's typically what you need, right? You need a lot of adoption, because that drives even more people using it. There's more requirements on the software, and there's more innovation. Looking at Postgres, for example, Postgres is an amazing story, right? Looking at how the latest 5-6 years have been just pretty amazing in terms of what they've been able to deliver in that project.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So looking at, let's say open source software that you can actually, run yourself, and then you have apparently the same version, right, which you can run through a hyperscaler. Like, for example, take MySQL. You can get MySQL, MySQL 8 or whatever, and then you can get it through Amazon, right, AWS. So one question is whether the software is not modified by the hyperscaler, right? Because can you just take whatever applications you're running, towards that version, in the cloud, and then say, okay, now I'm going to run it. Is it going to run, right? Because sometimes even if the API is the same, the semantics might not be the same, right? For example, Google Cloud SQL, it's the same API, but it's a different engine behind. We don't know what it is, right? So, then the question is it traditional database as a service running open source database? Is it open source, right? For example, as part of the service, you have a lot of automation to help run the full thing, right? But if you run it yourself, there is no automation. You got to do all that yourself. How do you see, running services that actually say they are running, vanilla open source software?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. I think you already answered it yourself. That's of course a problem. And as you said, like the API, I mean, it's great that some API might be stable, but in a lot of cases, the semantics, the background is actually very important. Databases are a great example, because they thought that there is an API called SQL, right? And you could say that, yeah, that just works with every database, but the details are important. The details, especially if you develop a non-trivial application, then the details are actually important. I mean, how certain indexes behave or something like that is, you could say, well, that's not my business, how it's implemented. But if you really have something more advanced, then it is actually important and you need to know what's happening there in the background. So that's a problem. As I said earlier, the HGPL tried to solve that problem in a way, but unfortunately only solves it half, because it means that if you're using a service like a MySQL operated by a hyperscaler, and the hyperscaler did the company does some modifications in the code, and you're using the API over the internet, then this also needs to be open sourced. Right? So basically the HGPL, and not a lot of software is HGPL, unfortunately, but the HGPL basically solves it probably half. So if there are modifications of the software or the engine or something on the server, then it needs to be open sourced. But what does it mean to be open sourced, right? It means usually that there's some download web page somewhere, you can download a tar file or something. But it doesn't mean that this goes into upstream. It doesn't mean this goes into the real product. Because if you're then a database vendor, if you're then MySQL, MariaDB or someone, and then say, okay, well, great, Google released some zip file with some changes, good for them. But it doesn't mean that this will go into the main product, because it might not be suitable for that, or there might be engineers or architects which have different design decisions. So the fragmentation is still there. This is unfortunately a problem.
What's your thought on, ops software automation, right? I mean, it's the same in a way with NextCloud, right? So you have the software, anybody can build it, and then you also have the service where you actually do the full automation, right? And there's a lot of IP that goes into running the service.
Mm-hmm.
Should that be open source?
I think so. Because, I mean, it all boils down to what you really want to achieve. And if you want to achieve sovereignty, which means you can actually decide to move from one cloud provider to another, or to on-prem, or to some, whatever you choose, then this should be possible. And if the whole tool chain around the software is so complicated that it cannot be easily be just, I mean, if it's just like a few lines of code or something, or just super simple Docker image, which it usually never is. But if it's just simple, fine. But if it's really so complicated, there's some kind of secret source in there which prevents then people to install it on-prem or on some other service provider. Then you have the vendor login again, right? Then you can say, well, the source code is free, but actually to run the software is so freaking complicated, no one can do it. Then you have the same problem again. So I think for complicated setups, it should also be open source, yes.
In a way, we could say perhaps that Kubernetes sort of solves that issue, because nowadays you have these types of, for example, for database, you have operators, right, where you can use those to at least to do, to take care of the ops, right? Now, having said that, most of these operators, they're not the full automation. They're at least part of it, right? But at least you're getting part of it, and then you got to do some work to complete the rest.
Yeah. It's also, in reality, it's often not so simple, because we at NextCloud, we have lots of big customers and lots of them use Kubernetes, but it does not mean at all that the environment is the same.
Okay.
I mean, it's the details, but the devil is in the details.
The devil is in the details. Yeah. I mean, I think on a high level, it always sounds good, but Kubernetes is being pushed as this kind of like, level playing field for everybody, right? But I think even there are things that maybe don't work as we think they would.
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you this. I mean, can you claim sovereignty if your data layer isn't based on open source databases.
Again, going back to what you actually want to achieve. If you want to achieve sovereignty in a way that you can move your application, your infrastructure, your company that you outsource to, if you want to move them around, if you want to switch from one vendor to another, then, and there is a proprietary component in your application, the data layer, as you said, and you can then move everything, but not the super important 2% of the stack. Yeah. Well, then this would be a problem. Yeah. I mean,
No, I think, and again, it comes back to control in a way, because, it seems the issue of control is something that maybe the term sovereignty addresses. Then I don't know if actually, those who are making the decisions, it's really control, or for them it's just that, hey, we're being told we need to be sovereign, so let's go and be sovereign, right? That's the other question, because it seems that nowadays many companies are driven by the bottom line. Right? How much profits we're making, how much costs we're cutting. I don't know. Let's get rid of our DBAs and put everything in Amazon, right? Kind of thing. But then it doesn't really work like that, because even if you run a managed service from a hyperscaler, you still end up having DBAs and DevOps people to look after the services. So one thing is to say, you outsource, but you don't really outsource everything, because you still need to have your own, resources in a way. So, but okay. So let's wrapping up here. You can say data transfer frameworks, right? They are weak in a way. I mean, looking at, for example, the GDPR. I mean, if we have the US as an approved third party, so to say, I mean, we are not really addressing the core issue here, right?
Yeah.
We're going to see another chance again soon.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe moving a little bit from the complaining mode into more optimistic mode here for a second. I think what we really want to have in the future is that, for example, companies like yours that are providing awesome services and have really a lot of knowledge and really have you can really help your customers because you're good. That these are the organizations then should be picked by the customers and not the ones with the strong vendor login, because it's we just run some standard service as everybody else could, but we are AWS. I'm sorry for hammering on AWS, but we're just we are the big gorilla here in the room and we don't let anyone out anymore. And this is why everybody is using it, even if the service is not actually very good. So I just would love to live in a world where actually excellence is driving success and not monopoly size. No.
And in a way, I mean, sovereign cloud from Amazon or Google, I mean, it's really token gestures. I mean, it's really putting lipstick on the pig, because it doesn't really address the actual core issue here. And in a way, to have control, you need to have this workload portability, which is based on the entire stack, right? And I mean, I think looking at the solutions point of view, I mean, sovereignty, it's a product of control, right? So I guess, what would you recommend enterprises to do in a way? One thing is to look at the, the actual legislation. What are we being told by the legislation to do? But this thing about control, how should enterprises actually, think about that?
Yeah. I think it's important to make a really informed decision here. It's not just following some marketing and following some, I don't know, everybody's doing it, so I should do the same. I mean, that's not an informed decision. If you really decide to outsource, talked about outsourcing earlier, outsource something, doesn't matter what it is, some, I don't know, your CRM or your database or whatever, then think about the consequences of that and think about also plan B and C and D, that you're really sovereign here, that you can actually later change your decision. I think it's also something that sovereignty means. So basically outsourcing to something where the product is structured in a way that you can move away from this cloud provider and also move to a different one with very, very minimal or no changes of your business process of your application. I think this is important. If you outsource to someone where you can never move away from ever again, then this is something I would advise against. And this is like the case for, I don't know, Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace or something like that. There's, or even, services like that, where it's they're not even APIs to move away. And even if there would be APIs, then there's no other ways to import it into, because the applications are not standardized in the way that there's just a one-to-one replacement where you can, I don't know, there's no way to move from Teams to Slack. This just does not work. There's no way to get your whole conversations, your whole history, everything behind, just move it over. It doesn't work. But this is something I would be very, very critical. If it's something like a more standardized layer, like a database, then this is something that makes more sense. But really think about the consequences and always have a plan B and C at hand, I think.
Excellent. Well, with those final words, Frank, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you, folks, for joining us in this episode, and see you for the next one.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, brought to you by Severalnines, the leader in intelligent multi-cloud database orchestration solutions for open source and source available databases. Like what you've heard in this episode? Then just follow the Sovereign DBaaS Decoded podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, or visit severalnines.com/podcast to get access to all the latest episodes.